Thanks for inviting me here today, and it is an opportune moment to discuss benchmarks with the recent IOSCO report principles coming out in the Commission proposal on the 18th of September. So I'm grateful to be part of this conversation. I'm eager to hear what the other panelists have to say, and also I'm eager to hear what everyone else has to say. I'll try and be brief in my opening remarks because I think these things work better with questions at the end, as long as it's not too difficult. So just keep that in mind. So when I was first given responsibility for benchmark reform in the Treasury, what I did was a lot of research. I spoke to regulators, other policymakers, market participants, that is users, administrators, contributors, think tanks, academics. I read articles. I basically immersed myself in a lot of benchmarks so that I could actually have a kind of idea of what we're looking at, what the policy issues are, and how do we resolve those policy issues with targeted interventions. And what I found, it surprised me somewhat, mostly because of the breadth and diversity of the benchmark universe. I mean, obviously I had an idea about things like LIBOR and Euribor and ISDA and other bits and pieces. But in terms of the more esoteric things like the salmon fishing index or the hurricane index, which, they sound slightly ridiculous, but it just tells you how broad it is and how some things are used often and everyone knows about them, everyone cares about them because in the press, but others are used very rarely and no one really knows about them. But when I approached this situation, the whole Commission proposal and IOSCO, my process looked at it from that angle, saying that, okay, it works for LIBOR like this, it works for FX like this, but how would it work for the salmon fishing index? It might be important, but if we're going to actually have something which works and is effective, we have to look at these sort of questions. So I guess the question is, where do we start? And for me, the starting point is probably the IOSCO principles, which, my perspective, and I think the Treasury's perspective, is that they were very good. It seemed that a lot of research was done in them, it's a consultation, and it came up with principles which are flexible enough to take into account the nuanced nature of the broad scope of benchmarks. I'm not going to go through them because I'm going to skip because of time, but I'm sure you've all read them and you've all looked over them. So let me touch on the governance issue. Now, I think we can all agree that good governance is something which is desirable, and we all want it. The question is, what exactly does good governance mean? And if I ask everyone in this room, I'm sure people have different views, not because of people trying to be difficult, trying to dilute down what good governance should be, but because they're approaching it from different aspects. So if it's a contributor, it means one thing, a user another thing, administrator something else, and even from a policymaker, it's something else. So I'll tell you what I think we can all agree on, and then I'll try and develop that. I think that good governance by administrators is fundamental to the benchmark setting process. It sets the foundation for a credible benchmark. So administrators, as the ones who produce the benchmark, have a duty to ensure they have governance procedures in place in the organisation to actually ensure the benchmark they produce is credible, is robust, and reflects what they're meant to reflect. That's not something which is contestable. And if it is, then you're probably not doing something properly in terms of your organisation. Now, the question is, what is reasonable to expect in terms of good governance? I can say that there are some caveats in the good governance thing in terms of what is within your control. Is everything you do within your control? Are contributions within your control? If you outsource something, is that within your control? Now, in terms of how we approach those questions, I think we need to look at two things. Firstly, I think the Commission is right in terms of looking at something like outsourcing, because regardless of where you outsource your calculations to, you should still be responsible for the benchmarks. However, I think there is concern about where you have to be responsible for what comes in. You have to be able to challenge what comes in, be able to have checks and balances in place to ensure that it's something which is effective and reasonable. But to be responsible for what someone else is doing just seems a step too far in my perspective. Conflicts of interest. Now, where they exist, both in the administrator and the contributors, they should be dealt with. There should be conflicts management procedures in place, and it should, because I think that's important to ensure that people see that good governance is done, not just saying we actually do it. Now, the question is, how do we deal with conflicts? Now, there's a range of issues, there's a range of approaches. I think it depends on the administrator or the contributor, which markets they're in, and what those conflicts are, because we can't assume that the conflicts which exist elsewhere, for example, conflicts which might exist in LIBOR, are going to be the same sort of conflicts you see in other markets. Some don't have any conflicts at all because the nature of the contributors and the administrators means that they're actually not trying to benefit from the outcome of the benchmark. And finally, I think that an administrator should be willing to be challenged and held accountable for their benchmark. That's held accountable by contributors, by users, by regulators, by the wider market. But I think the first challenge has to come from within the administrator. So if you're producing a benchmark, you have to be able to challenge yourself is it robust? Am I doing everything I can to ensure that my benchmark is credible? Am I challenging myself every day to see how I can improve it? And how am I watching the market more broadly to understand how my benchmark fits into that and if it's still reasonable in the ongoing situation? Now, none of what I said there is revolutionary. I don't think anyone would disagree with it. But I think the difficult question is how do we apply those sort of principles to individual benchmarks? I think that it's not easy to say there's a one-size-fits-all approach. And I noticed from the panel before lots of questions towards Philip and attacks on the Commission proposal. I'm not going to do that, but I think it's a difficult task for them to come up with something which is codified IOSCO law in some format, as well as take into account other issues which they see as potential problems in benchmarks. But I would say that because we're not trying to get a one-size-fits-all approach, we have to be very, very wary of what we are doing. And we have to be more challenging ourselves as policymakers and as regulators about how does this impact this benchmark, how does that impact that benchmark. If we can't answer those questions, but we just don't know, I think that possibly there is something wrong with the regulation in that sense. Transparency. I think transparency is important. Once again, a non-controversial statement. We all want transparency. It helps people, users, to know what's in a benchmark, how it operates, what the inputs are. But there is such a thing as too much transparency, which might be slightly controversial there. And I know I've heard concerns about intellectual property rights and those sort of things, and I do hear those. But the transparency that I'm envisaging is not about that sort of thing. Transparency can go too far. We can now have situations whereby too much transparency might help people to be able to manipulate the market. And I understand that in terms of some administrators, they get the data from others who license them and trying to give that out, that's problematic. So what we must go for is something which is proportionate and appropriate, which probably doesn't fill anyone with confidence, because those words can be interpreted in many different ways. What I think is proportionate and appropriate might not be what you think, because you're the ones trying to make money from your benchmarks. Those who have benchmarks in the room. But I do think that that's what we have to live with, because otherwise what we're going to end up having is really, really strict rules for each individual benchmarks, which, unless we go through the process of checking them all, we're not going to know how that actually applies. Touching briefly on LIBOR, because that's something I know more about. So LIBOR regulations came out, was it last summer now? Yes, 2012. It's been a quick year. And the government took immediate steps, appointing Martin Wheatley to review LIBOR and the underlying supervisory regime for LIBOR. After 13 weeks, the Wheatley review came up with some targeted reforms for LIBOR, which the government fully endorsed and has been implemented since. For example, we amended the Financial Services Act 2012 to bring LIBOR activity within the scope of regulatory regulation, including the submission and administration of LIBOR. We created a new criminal offence for misleading statements related to LIBOR, as well as strengthening language for existing offences. And we provided the FCA with the power to compel banks to participate in the LIBOR setting process. Now, and also finally, I forgot to mention that there was the independent committee led by Baroness Hogg to find a new administrator for LIBOR. Now, the Wheatley review came with a 10-point plan, and all of them important for the reform of LIBOR. But I'm going to just quote one specific section of the Wheatley review, which states that the new administrator of LIBOR should fulfil specific obligations as part of its governance and oversight of the rate, having due regard to transparency and fair and non-discriminatory access to the benchmark. These obligations would include surveillance and scrutiny of submissions, publication of statistical digestible rate submissions, and periodic reviews addressing the issues of whether LIBOR continues to meet market needs effectively and credibly. Now, that's the official story of LIBOR, but what you might not know is the work that went into this. The review team, who I know some of them, and I was around when they were working on it, they spent 13 weeks, that was long nights, weekends, reading things, meeting with people, meeting with users, contributors, the BBA, trying to understand what the flaws were, to see where what the FCA had done, where the concerns were, where the gaps were in the regulation, those kind of things, to come up with this targeted approach. And I think, in an ideal world, what we would have is a review for all benchmarks, because then we would say, this is what the problem is, this is how we solve it. But of course, we don't live in an ideal world. So I don't think that's an excuse for us to allow ourselves to go into a place where we have suboptimal outcomes by trying to do something quickly without fully understanding what the implications are. There is a balance to be caught and to be found. I think that balance is somewhere. I don't know where it is yet, but I'm sure when I get to negotiations on benchmarks, I'll be able to say what the UK thinks that balance is. I'm going to end there and just say that I think it's all very difficult, and I think that judging by the different views from different parties, you can tell how difficult it is. I think that we have to accept there's no easy outcomes. We have to find a solution because there is clearly a problem with some benchmarks. I'm not going to say all benchmarks because I don't know that for sure. Despite ongoing investigations, those are some of them just investigations right now, so let's not try and prejudge the outcomes. And I noticed someone earlier mentioned problems with London, but I don't want to accept that. It's a global benchmark, a global problem, so let's keep that in mind. I think that in order to ensure we get the best outcomes, we just need to approach this in a manner that is proportionate, targeted and appropriate. And when we say that, we have to know what we mean by it. We have to make sure we're engaged with industry, with users, with regulators, with academics, because this has an impact on all areas of the market. We can't just say benchmarks in an isolated little box. If we do this here, it's not going to affect this over here. Judging by people who use them, people who submit to them, people who make them, it affects us all. So I think that it's important that we engage constructively and find a solution which not only works for the benchmark administrators here in Europe, but also works globally and is in line with global standards.